Today, the first reading is from Jeremiah, chapter 1, verses 4 to 10. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And then I said, Ah, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. But the Lord said to me, Do not say, I am only a boy, for you shall go to all to whom I send you, and you shall speak wherever I commanded you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up, to pull down, to destroy, to overthrow, to build, and to plant. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right. Let us turn towards the letter that Paul wrote the first time to the Corinthians. If I speak in tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am just a noisy gong or even a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all of my possessions, and if I have hand over my body that I boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have never been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide. These three. And the greatest of these is love. The greatest of these is love. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, I feel like there have been times when I've been nervous about a sermon, and y'all just love it anyway. So I'm a little nervous about this one, but I also think, well, they're just cold. So here we go. On our flight this past summer to Europe, I got in line for the restroom, but after waiting, and then knocking, another woman and I were like, we should do something about this. Let's call a flight attendant. So 2 flight attendants came over, and indeed they decided it's time to go in, and so they found a person either close or unconscious in the restroom. And at this point, the other woman and I were like, oh gosh, okay. So we kind of, backed into, it's a big airplane, but not that big, and so we backed into the seats to let all the hustle and bustle come in, and we were pinned in this kind of strange spot and couldn't get back to our seats. And so there we were, and we're actually kind of up on our tippy toes, because there are 2 Hasidic Jews who were praying right there. Have you seen Hasidic Jews pray? They rock back and forth, just constantly. And they were just rocking back and forth, and all of this is happening, and this is 2 grown men taking up a lot of space. They didn't seem to care about the man in the bathroom or the 2 of us who couldn't get by them. And I thought, really? You think God cares more about you proving your faith by saying the same prayer you prayed 4 hours ago, then maybe, I don't know, praying for the guy in the restroom, or at least taking up less space so that we can sit down and let the doctor do her job. I did not tell this story to ridicule Jews. In fact, I almost didn't tell it because I didn't want you to hear that. Rather, I want to say something exactly the opposite of ridiculing Jews. I want to say it sure is easy to point out when other religions or other denominations or other types of people are hypocritical. It's easier to notice when they're doing it. But Christians, my friends, we have been taking up room and rocking back and forth since Christianity was a thing. The Corinthians were doing a lot of rocking and taking up a lot of room. Taking up a lot of room with doing things well and beautifully and moving mountains and prophesying and speaking grand tongues, right? They loved this about themselves. They were invested in check marks and who was better and who knew more and who was a bigger, better, stronger Christian. That's what made them Christians, is outdoing the other with the best. They were so impressed with their faith and their hope, they completely forgot that the greatest of these is love. Now, for a lot of people, this passage written to the Corinthians is wedding jargon. How many had this read at your wedding? It makes sense. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful sentiment about love. And, maybe if you're 20 and getting married, this does seem like a flowery passage. Maybe if you're older or if you've been through a lot together with your person, even if you are 20, maybe you know that this passage is more than flowers. Because that's not how Paul intended it. This passage does say many a nice thing about the emotion, the noun and the verb, love. There's a reason why we use this at weddings. It's so good. It's so good. But Paul did not intend this to be romantic. And I dare say, most pastors, when they preach this at weddings, probably don't mean it to be romantic either. They probably mean it to be lasting. Paul intended it to interrupt. Right? He wasn't trying to give them flowers and candy. This was not Valentine's Day for him. He intended to interrupt the church at Corinth, to just shake them, to even upset them. He wanted, we don't do this here, I'm very thankful for, but a lot of churches, the pastor after the service walks down to the end of the church and people shake their hands and tell him, good job, or that was awful. And that's what they did to him on the way out. They're like, brother, we can't stand you. This didn't work for us. Why? They liked it. They liked their lives. They liked the way things were. It was the way society worked. They kept doing their old way of being and then added this Jesus story, right, to their hierarchical societies. They just kept everything the same and invited a few things in. Said, okay, we've changed enough. It's not their fault humanity seems to just work that way. They kept their old life. Brilliant. It's basically like being on the Whole30 diet, right? For the first 30 days of January, you change your life completely. You've got prepared meals in your fridge, and then the Super Bowl comes around and, well, wings. And sour cream dip. And then wings put into sour cream dip with buffalo sauce on top of pizza. Now, I'll do away with that for now. What they didn't get was Christianity wasn't just a moment. Because I think they thought it was just to graduate, right? Okay, we've done junior year, let's get to senior year, let's move on. A jump start, that jump into the next diet. Something to follow through to something else. No, Paul is saying to them, this is a every time, all day, everywhere, 24/7 type of deal. But they weren't so different from us. As we know, they had a lot of different things, and maybe they had chariot races instead of 5Ks, but these are the same people as us. It's so much easier to not have to really do things differently. It's so much easier to just change the name of things, and I'm so guilty of this. I love doing this. To change the names of things like, oh, we'll call this the gathering place instead of the sanctuary, right? Isn't that lovely modern term, the gathering place? Maybe that will get my generation into church. But let's not mess with anything else. Let's not change what happens in the gathering place. There are times when our individual or collective understanding of God, right? In fact, the more we get together as these people, right? As the Presbyterian Church, as the Delaware Newcastle Presbytery, if we get all of ourselves together, right, we become a vacuum. No matter which way we believe, we become this vacuum. And we become a people who, all of a sudden, there's a narrow focus, and we no longer recognize the religion we formed has become religion instead of a way. No longer recognizing what we've attached ourselves to and why, and no longer recognize who we've let in, or maybe we do, rather who we've pushed out. We just don't see it because it's so easy. This is also a sermon for me, y'all. I mean this to me just as much. And one reason I knew this was for me is I heard about this church, a Presbyterian church in Fairfax, Virginia, that recently knocked its church building down and in its place put affordable housing for retired folks and people who needed assisted living. Then they made this a multifunctional church. Their church house was an old folks' home. On the bottom floors, there was a big gathering place where they had all sorts of things happening. There was a basketball court. It was beautiful. It was beautifully done. But it didn't function like we think of things functioning. And then upstairs, above the kind of church spaces and the rooms that they might practice religion in, that's where they had living. That's where they had people living. People from the church, people from the community, poor folks that they wouldn't have had anything to do with otherwise. And guess what? A lot of those folks are starting to come to church there. Super easy commute. It works for so many reasons. That's scary. That's a lot of change. That's a lot of letting go of ideas of church. It's a lot of pain. I've been here for technically less than a year, and the idea of this being knocked down, that's painful for me. Less than a year in. It's a lot of pain. It's a lot of frustration. That's a lot of session meetings. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of heated or unheated discussions. It's a lot of hurt feelings. It's a lot of history. And perhaps most, that's a lot of love. Because they had to love people over stained glass. They had to love the future of their congregation over loving their 1945 brilliantly carved pulpit. They had to do a lot of loving. But what is this love anyway? When Paul was trying to tell this church who was doing everything right, they were the star pupils. And he's like, you're still not doing it. What does love mean? Well, I think you know. Love is a lot of things, and it isn't always pretty. Love of a country can find you in a minefield in Afghanistan. Love can find you fighting your child as you place her in the arms of a drug rehabilitation center. Love can find you trying to understand your husband's wish to stop chemo. Love can find you rethinking your retirement. Love can make you uncomfortable. It can make you unsure. It makes you vulnerable, absolutely. I'll stick to faith and hope and just love what I already love. Thanks, Paul. Love, it's not easy to find, but if you do some digging, which I did a good bit of digging, if you do this and this and this and this, you find that it has The root of love comes from the word womb, or rather womb-like. That's right, womb. Like the passage from Jeremiah, the womb offers birth. To love is to bring something into the world, and all the pain that goes with it. But in the end, there is a life-giving quality to love no matter what. Something Jesus shows us on his way to, during and from the cross. Sadly, it too often takes that kind of huge moment, that cross moment, to stop us from rocking back and forth and taking up space instead of giving it to others. There have been several times in the past few months that I've heard of something called the Green Book. Do y'all know what I'm talking about when I say that? Oh gosh, most of you do. I've been asking people all week. For those of you not shaking your head, I had no clue either. But I heard it on a podcast, and then on a movie, and then in a blog I read. Its full title is called The Negro Motorist Green Book. It's created by a mailman who noticed space being taken up. During the Jim Crow law era, Vincent Green started hearing story after story of his family and friends, black families, not being able to travel easily. And one Texas senator remembers having a college meeting in Waco. He was in college in Houston. And he and 3 of his white female classmates drove from Houston to Waco to Baylor to go to this meeting. I know those roads. They're still not good roads. But during Jim Crow, those back roads were also deadly roads for ones like this Texas senator, a black man traveling with 3 white females. And when they were traveling, the only way he was allowed to eat lunch was if the girls told the restaurants that they had hired a boy to drive them. That was one story that started off this Green Book. Stories of families that this mailman, Vincent Green, heard who were not allowed to use the restroom, but certainly were allowed to give their money to buy gasoline and oil. Stories of families having to sleep in cars, and worse, and so much worse, and worse and worse. So Mr. Green made a travel guide telling black families where they could eat, where they could use the restroom, where they could find a hotel and pump gas and use the restroom at the same time, and which towns to completely avoid altogether. It was a huge hit, and it probably saved lives. He wrote in the introduction, he made it annually, he wrote in the introduction to each year's guide, there will be a day when we no longer need this guide. Until then, here you go. And then one day, the NAACP turned to the travel guides and said, this is it. This is our story. This is our story. They introduced the Civil Rights Act on a hot, muggy July, on the last day Congress was set to leave. Set to leave town to travel back to their own families, hot, muggy, on long road trips. And they asked Congress, what would it look like if you took your daughter on a trip? Where would you get her a soda on a day like today? Where will you be able to use the restroom after too much caffeine? Where will you find respite from the heat? Where will you feed your family? Where will you stay the night? For the first time, lawmakers were like, oh. And in that story, they started to understand how love works. You have to stop taking up space and let others in for the sake of love of humanity. You have to put an end, even if it's hard, to the old way of doing things, to do the hard, bold, uncomfortable work of making room. People like Vincent Green loved their community, strangers even, so much that he birthed this idea, a social network to keep people safe, and that birth created life for a movement, for a story that birthed the Civil Rights Act. And then 2 years after the Civil Rights Act, because it takes a long time for change, the Green Book was finally stopped production. I guarantee there were Christian families turning away black families. I guarantee I knew some of their grandchildren. I guarantee there were pastors who thought it their